Good evening, afternoon or morning, Movie Cat is at the microphone. Today I'm going to tell you about a film based on the true events that led to the passing of the 1968 Fair Housing Act in the United States, which made it illegal to refuse to sell or rent property based on race, religion, or gender. For your attention is a biographical drama of 2020. The Banker.
Did I not wake up black this morning? Because I'm pretty sure I did.
1939 Texas. 9-year-old Bernard Garrett earns money by cleaning shoes for white bankers, financiers and real estate specialists on the street. Bernard listens attentively to their business conversations and discreetly writes down everything he remembers. Bernard's father, seeing the notes, tells his son that he is very smart and talented. The problem is that in the state of Texas the level of racism is extremely high and whites will not give Bernard a job in finance, no matter how good he is. So Bernard decides that he will move from Texas. 15 years later, Bernard drives his own car to Los Angeles with his wife Eunice and son. Bernard has amassed a wealth of capital in recent years with the help of his cleaning company in Texas, and now he wants to invest that money in the purchase of a building. After a long and careful search, Bernard finds the right building, for which he just has the necessary amount. But he does not have enough to repair the apartments, which means he will not be able to rent them out. Then his wife Eunice invites her husband to meet the owner of the club where she used to dance, Joe Morris, and consider him as an investor and business partner. Bernard comes to the club and sees Joe Morris, who jokes a lot, laughs and offers to drink a triple whiskey in the middle of a day. Bernard thinks that Joe is not serious enough to do business with him and leaves the club without talking about the business proposal. Eunice thinks that Bernard has the wrong impression of Joe. She says the only way out now is to ask the owner of the building to reduce the price. Bernard, during the next negotiations with Barker, the owner of the building, emphasizes that half of his apartments are rented out cheaply and half are completely empty due to lack of repair. Bernard plans to rent them out all and even more expensive. It is possible because black doctors and lawyers are ready to pay more, if only to move from the ghetto to a good area. Barker politely refuses to reduce the price and also refuses to lend money to buy his own building. Suddenly attentive Bernard notices on Barker's gift calendar with the name of his bank manager. In the morning, Bernard comes to the bank, but the secretary, looking at the color of the visitor's skin, says that the manager is absent. When Bernard shows her that the manager is sitting behind her, the secretary replies that he is very busy. Bernard waits until the end of the working day, catches the manager on the street and asks him for a loan to buy the building, because it will benefit everyone, including the owner of the building. In the evening, Barker calls Bernard and asks if Bernard really used his name to get a loan from his banker to buy his own building, and is this way of doing business consistent with common practice. Contrary to Bernard's expectations, Barker called not to accuse him, but to say that he agreed to make a loan because he appreciated Bernard's professionalism and determination. The deal is successful. The building in the White District now belongs to Bernard, so Eunice invites him to enjoy the moment. They go to the club for a few drinks. There, Joe approaches Bernard, treats him to a cigar and says that he likes it when blacks succeed. Joe is even glad to invest in the most talented and smartest ones. Bernard is renovating a purchased building with his cousin. Later, Matt, a white friend of the cousin, joins them. To Bernard's fears that he might not be comfortable working for a black man, Matt replies the main thing is that he is paid in green money, and this is the only color that worries him. During renovations, a local racist old lady calls the cops because she doesn't believe a black man can own the building. For this case, Bernard always carries a copy of the ownership certificate in his pocket to show it to the police. A few months later, after the renovation, Bernard rents out all the apartments and returns everything he owed Barker. Barker, in response, offers to buy buildings together, dividing earnings 50-50. Bernard will deal with the assessment plus repairs, and Barker will negotiate and sign documents, because other brokers will not want to sell buildings to a black guy. Business is going well and Bernard buys a house for himself to move in with his family. Suddenly, Barker dies, and his widow, after consulting with a lawyer, wants to buy out Bernard's share in the business for next to nothing. because she does not want to work with a black man. Since Bernard's name is nowhere on the documents, the only way to prove that he had a partnership agreement with the late Barker is to find a witness. The bank manager is the only such witness, but he refuses to even talk to Bernard. And then Bernard comes up with a brilliant idea. He goes to Joe and suggests that they need to buy a building where 6 large Los Angeles banks rent offices at once, the tallest building in the center, which is considered an architectural gem of the central area. The banks that will be their tenants will no longer be able to so blatantly ignore Bernard when their cooperation is required. Joe likes the idea because, as he says, retribution in the enemy's castle is audacious. They only need to find a white person who will formally own the bank building and the next buildings they will buy. For this purpose, Bernard offers his assistant Matt, who is smart and ambitious enough to get the job done. Bernard has a month to teach Matt the building valuation formulas and the finer points of negotiation, so he can buy the building for less than $2 million. Joe, meanwhile, teaches Matt how to drink whiskey and how to play golf, because that's the language spoken by the rich. Eunice shows Matt how to properly behave at the table. A month later, Matt masters the mathematics of a broker and is already a good golfer. The owner of the building, of course, will not negotiate with a person who has come from the street, so Joe sets up a chance meeting for them at an elite golf club. After playing together the next day, Matt is negotiating with the owner. To impress him, Matt pretends he is counting in his mind complex calculations of the building cost with different values of the variables in the formula for its assessment. Bernard knew in advance several options for the values of variables, so Matt learned all the calculations by heart. The owner is very impressed and sells the building for just over $1.5 million. Now when 6 banks are renting offices in Bernard's own building, he can negotiate loans with them. After that, Bernard begins to implement his main plan. He buys houses in white neighborhoods and helps black families move out of the ghetto, making a lot of money for himself and Joe along the way. Matt receives a very large salary for being the formal owner of all the purchased buildings. A few years later, Matt gets married. 1963, Bernard travels to Texas to visit his father. In Texas, Bernard sees that the issue of racial injustice is more acute here than anywhere else. Bernard wants to help black people and he has an idea how to do it. He comes back to Los Angeles and offers Joe to buy a bank in Texas. Joe asks not to keep silent about the difficulties. For example, that they are both black and the bank is in Texas. Then Bernard says that by owning a bank, they can help black people in Texas by issuing loans to start businesses and buy houses. Joe answers he knows other ways to help black people, and in Texas, buying a bank will only turn into big problems. But Joe agrees to take a risk. Joe, dressed as a driver, brings Matt to Texas. Matt goes with Joe's personal banker and they buy the mainland bank. The previous owner is selling it on the condition that his son Robert Florence will work in this bank and receive 20% of the profit. Later, Bernard gathers black community leaders from all over Texas and asks them to send all reliable borrowers who need a loan for a home or their business. Meanwhile, Florence keeps an eye on Matt's every move, because he dreamed of becoming the boss, not reporting to a guy from California 10 years younger than him. Matt's wife does not like that they moved to Texas and she constantly reproaches her husband that Bernard and Joe still have not taken him as a partner, but simply pay him a salary, even if it is a high one. A few days later, Florence, following Matt, comes to Bernard's house and makes it clear that he knows that the borrowers are black. Florence threatens to send an anonymous complaint about unreliable lending, and in a few weeks an inspector will visit the bank. When Florence leaves, Matt offers to buy another smaller bank to transfer all black families' loans there, while the mainland check is underway. Bernard doesn't like this idea, but Matt sets a condition: he must be the owner of the second bank and a full partner, otherwise he will return back to Los Angeles. Bernard and Joe buy a small bank, Marlin, and ask Matt to contact their trusted lawyer to verify the legitimacy of the transfer of loans. Unexpectedly, the checking inspector comes not to the mainland, as expected, but to the Marlin and finds illegal loans. Some of them exceed the limit for a bank of such a small size, others are issued for a period longer than allowed, and still others with too high a risk of non-payment. Bernard and Joe, who have disguised themselves as cleaners and hid in the bank's bathroom, ask why Matt didn't check the loans. Matt replies that he only checked the first page of each loan, but it turns out that the loan size information was on the second one. Bernard is surprised that their lawyer overlooked this. Matt confesses that Bernard's trusted lawyer was busy and Matt asked Florence to advise him another lawyer. Bernard realizes that Florence's lawyer has changed Marlene's loan information in order to gain an advantage in the mainland that Florence dreams of owning. A few days later, Joe receives a call from his banker, who, through his friend Inspector, learned that Matt bought all the bad loans of Marlene on behalf of the mainland bank. To save his bank, Matt endangered the mainland. Bernard and Joe furiously break into Matt's office in the mainland and demand the ledgers. At this moment, people from the Financial Investigation Department enter the building and close the bank for illegal activities. On the street, the FBI arrests Bernard and Joe, but do not explain what exactly they are accused of. The next day, the lawyer explains to Bernard and Joe that they have been arrested in order to hold a hearing to expose the acquisition of 2 federal banks by 2 black men. The purpose of the hearing is also to set a precedent and rewrite the laws in the country so that blacks no longer own banks. If Bernard and Joe tell everything as it really was and will not interfere, they are guaranteed immunity. Meanwhile, the chairman of the hearing visits Matt and intimidates him in order to have an advantage during the process. The chairman invites Matt to say at the hearing that Bernard and Joe manipulated him to make illegal loans at the banks. If Matt did it on his own initiative, then the chairman promises to send him to prison for a long time. The next day during the preliminary hearing, Matt says that all his actions were done under the orders of his immediate superiors, Joe and Bernard. Later, the chairman meets Bernard informally and offers him a choice: immunity and the removal of all charges in exchange for the recognition that Bernard took advantage of loopholes in the law and enriched himself due to this, or Bernard can deny everything and then his immunity will be removed, and then, based on Matt's testimony, Bernard and Joe will be sent to prison for libel. During the hearing, Bernard loudly and surely says that the founders of the country proclaimed all people equal, but in fact, blacks cannot take out a loan for a house or business, which means they cannot get rich. The chairman tries to interrupt Bernard, and the journalists in the hall make a fuss. At the end of the speech, Bernard asks the chairman why it is so important to him to deprive an entire race of the American dream. In 1965, a white jury found Bernard and Joe guilty of misuse of bank funds and sentenced them to 3 years in prison. Of the 177 buildings that Bernard and Joe owned, Eunice only had 1 left because the deal was in her name. Robert Florence bought the mainland bank at auction for a fraction of the money Bernard and Joe paid his father. 3 years later, Bernard is released from a prison. He is greeted by Joe and Eunice. Bernard says that not everything was taken from them, because there were 2 more buildings in the Bahamas. That evening the chairman gave Matt an ultimatum. The guy called Bernard and told him that he was facing 50 years in prison if he didn't say what the chairman wanted. Bernard allowed Matt to say whatever he needed, but in return he asked the guy for a favor. With the money that they have not been confiscated yet, Matt should buy 2 buildings in the Bahamas. Thank you for watching. Write in the comments if The Banker, a story about intelligence, enterprise and courage, is your favorite biographical movie. If not, write in the comments your favorite one. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the finger high.